Today's episode is sponsored by Midwest Fire. For more than 20 years, Midwest Fire has been manufacturing high-quality tankers, tanker pumpers, and fire rescue vehicles in the United States and Canada. Keeping firefighters safe while enhancing their capabilities is what they do best. To learn more, visit them at midwestfire.com. Hello and welcome to episode 11 of Situational Awareness Matters radio show. I'm your host, Rich Gassaway. The purpose of this show is to improve situational awareness and decision making for individuals and teams who work in high-risk, high-consequence environments. The SA Matters mission is simple: to help you see the bad things coming and time to avoid bad outcomes. Recently, I had an opportunity to tour the Seattle Fire Department training facility, and I sat down and talked with Phil Jose, the training chief for the Seattle Fire Department. During the interview, Chief Jose shared some of the things that he and the department are focused on for improving situational awareness and decision-making abilities of the Seattle firefighters, including conducting post-incident analysis of major fire incidents, defined as one that results in a firefighter injury, a civilian fatality, or a third alarm or greater. Their efforts toward officer development, despite the challenges that they face with operating short-staffed, and short-staffed means roughly 100 vacant firefighter positions. How they're working to instill the core competencies of trust, competence, and vision in their members. How they're working with company officers who would arrive first in at fires to develop situational awareness and to help them make high-quality decisions. The interview begins with a discussion about how the Seattle Fire Department is using post-incident analysis to learn lessons and to improve their fire operations. So let's listen to what Chief Jose has to share.
So we do post-incident analyses on most of our major fires, and there's criteria that are in our policy. If firefighter injury, civilian fatality, multiple alarm, it's actually a third alarm or higher. Those are all of our standard criteria. We also have the discretion for the on-duty deputy chief or the assistant chief of operations to just request one because they think an event the department would be served by analyzing the event. So once we identify an event that's going to occur, then the post-incident analysis team sort of takes over. They send out to the operations. So anybody who actually responded on the event, or at least the major players for the event, will be sent a form to fill out. It's called a Form 55, and it sort of asks some sort of generic questions about what you did, were you first in, were you second in, that sort of thing. But also has some room for some narrative, and those are all submitted electronically to the post-incident analysis mailbox. And then the team starts going through those, and the goal of those is the goal of the overall post-incident analysis team is to analyze the event, to document what happened, look at the event, and analyze it against a standard. So against a policy that we have, against NFPA standard, against a book, an industry book, some place where we can hang our hat that says this is what we should or shouldn't be doing. Sometimes it's policy, but not always necessarily. It could be. We also have best practice documents. So there's a bunch of places where the analysis, the standard against which actions are measured. They're not measured to the individual, that sort of thing. So it's all generic it doesn't identify the person, it just identifies the rig, the riding position, that sort of thing. Of course, if you're in the organization currently, you could look that stuff up. But sure.
You said a team.
Yeah, we have a team.
How many on the team, and where did the team come from? Did they volunteer to do this? Are they assigned to do this? What's the consistency of the team?
So the team, it's morphed over time. Currently the team has, so there's 2 committee chairs, which is the deputy chief of training, which is myself, and then there's one operations deputy chief as well that are the committee chairs. We work with the captain, which is the committee supervisor, and the captain is really the one that runs the team. We manage it from an administrative level. We do some of the budgeting, although the captain does some as well. But the captain really runs the team, and so underneath the captain, or within the team, there's a group of firefighters, lieutenants, captains. We're currently in the process of adding some battalion chiefs to that team that would, in this case, be part of the developmental process. But for each event, 4 individuals within that team are assigned. They do the transcription of the radio, collection of the Form 55s, scene documentation, and then the actual the team lead sort of coordinates that activity. So you have a team lead and then plus 3 people.
Who does the write-up, the actual report write-up?
So one of those 4 people is the assigned writer, and there's actually 2 assigned writers. One is assigned to the narrative, which is here's what happened at this event, and the other one sort of captures the effective actions and the observations and recommendations which are footnoted in the report, but which are in sort of the NIOSH fashion addressed at the end of the report. So that you can sort of correlate what happened to either an effective action or an observation recommendation for a change. And then they edit. So they edit the document. They put it together, edit it, review it. Then it gets submitted to the team supervisor, which is the captain. The captain sends it to the committee chairs, which are battalion or deputy level. Then there's a process that we go through at our level to review it for command function and some data, and also just questions that were like, hey, this is unclear when I read it, and then a little more editing, and then it goes basically from that process to the assistant chief of operations. Chief of operations gets to red pencil their ideas on there. The fire chief gets to red pencil his ideas onto there, and then we publish them, and that whole process takes somewhere between 3 and 5 months.
Now, you had said that there's some comparison of what happened to industry best practices, to NFPA, to a book that's been written. Who does that level of research and brings those lessons into that report?
So the team does. So within the team, everybody that's on that team of 4, so one is doing all the radio transcription, but the other members are reading through that once it's produced. The Form 55s, which are the event summaries from the people who responded, somebody reads all of them and then sort of filters them for the ones that matter, and then we actually conduct interviews where necessary to clarify. And then all those notes, so that team, everybody on that team sort of understands the incident from all those levels. Then they get a meeting together and say, okay, here's where we think the critical junctures in this incident were. Here's where we see where there were effective actions. Here's where we see where we missed some opportunities or we went sideways or whatever it is. I mean, it's not a witch hunt. It's not a whitewash. It's a clear and accurate assessment of what we did, warts and all. Once they sort of understand where those critical junctures are in the incident, that's when the narrative is written to make sure that we capture the incident around those events so that people can understand the before and after and how those events all played into whatever the outcome was. I mean, most of the outcomes end up being positive anyway, but sometimes we just struggle a little bit to get there. And it doesn't have to be we have an incident that goes really well that meets the criteria. We do an analysis of it, just like Super Bowl champions review football film every weekend, right? So that's how we look at it. Is it doesn't have to be a negative event. It can be an event that goes well, and we'll still do that analysis and see where our successes were and even where our challenges were. Even events that go well are still going to have areas where somebody missed a block, for example, still scored a touchdown, but somebody still missed a block. So we're trying to capture both the positives and the negatives in all these events.
And then does the report like you'd mentioned a NIOSH report, which always then culminates with a list of recommendations to, improve from that particular event. Does your report also then include some recommendations at the end of it?
It does, yeah. And so there's always a list of both effective actions and recommendations for improvement, or areas where we might want to add some emphasis. And then over the course of time, so the PIA committee itself is only charged with analyzing the incidents and producing the recommendations. The ownership of the recommendations and how they're adjudicated over time or handled or whatever does not rest with the PIA team. Right now, that's a gap that we're working hard to address, is setting up a team of people who will actively take the recommendations and say it's a policy implication, maybe look at our policy book, rewrite it if necessary, get the appropriate buy-in from the stakeholders and all of that process. But that would be separate from the analysis piece. And by design, it was that the people on the analysis side have the freedom to just measure the performance against the standard. Mm-hmm. And it's just taken us a little longer than I think everybody would have liked or thought to get to this other piece, because we did have struggles in the development of the PIA process to where we are now. I mean, we're much stronger 5 years later. But we recognized we were having, because we were starting a new process for us, we had the growing pains, and we wanted to make sure that we got through those well before we started to pick up this other side of the equation, recognizing there's a delay, but 20 years from now, both sides of this puzzle will be in place and be able to serve the department well. But in the meantime, there have been a number of areas that we've struggled that we've been able to pick up through other training mechanisms. So probably the most glaring example, if you read through every single report we've produced, is that at first there were very seldom did we get 360s of fire buildings, even small single-family residences. It was often very late into the incident before we would get a 360. And sometimes the only 360 was done by we have an on-duty safety chief that responds to every fire. That might only be the safety chief who does a 360. So we were identifying that 360s needed to be done earlier in the event, but there was no policy that it needed to be done, and there was no standard practice or expectation. So what happened there was both the chief of training at the time and the chief of operations at the time both started to emphasize that in their respective worlds. So in training, in our decision-making training and our tactics training and stuff like that, the topic of 360s, in the train the trainers, it was just brought up like, hey, start talking about how important 360s are. The assistant chief of operations says 360s are important. We want to start emphasizing them, and we did that in training. At the same time, the assistant chief of operations is going to his on-duty deputies meetings, on-duty battalion meetings, and saying, that he was holding monthly and saying, look, 360s are important. Here's why they're important. They're important for firefighter safety, for situational awareness, so he sent the message strongly as well, right? So we're covering both sides of the coin. And then so as you watch the documents, the PIA documents progress over time, now we're actually at the point where, unless it's prohibitive by the size of the structure, you have a block square apartment building, it's a little difficult to do a 360 when you're
Sure.
in the first rig, and situational awareness may not demand a 360 of a structure of that size and scope, depending on the type of event. Seeing two sides of an apartment building on fire might be plenty if those are the two sides that are involved, for example. But in most events where it's practical, usually the first-in officers are now getting a 360. The first-in engine officer usually does one. The first-in truck officer usually does one. The safety chief still does one. And generally speaking, the first-in battalion chief or the first-in deputy chief will get a 360. So we're getting 3 or 4 spread over the course of the first, from minute 0 till minute probably 6 or 7. And we're getting it both. We're getting it from not just both, but from three sides, really from four, I guess, if you think about it. Now is the engine side, the truck side, the command side, and the safety side are all sort of having an independent 360. That doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen way more consistently than it did at the start of the document. And there's other examples in the documents that would show you a progression over time for the organization. And there's some areas where I could tell you right now that the next PIA that we do on a fire event will cite the NFA handshake model for communications and say that we're not consistently using the NFA handshake model. It's probably been in every single fireground report that we've had to date, or maybe we haven't added it in some because there were other things that rose to a higher level, but we consistently are struggling with that. Now we're better than we were 5 years ago, but we're definitely not 100%. And that is a situational awareness piece that if you're not hearing every radio transmission, if you're throwing things out there and people aren't picking them up, or you think a message was received and it wasn't, can have a pretty big impact down the road. So, that's an area where we have identified a weakness. We're working, but it's being more challenging than I think that I would have thought 5 years we could probably have we've made progress, but not as much as we have, say, on the 360. So even though I think as a department are identifying these weaknesses and we're actively attacking them in some measure, we're about to start attacking them in a much stronger measure over the next 2 to 3 years. And I would anticipate, looking long term, we're producing 12 to 15 of these a year. That pattern will continue as we start to pick up the recommendation side and to more actively not only manage that, but push the different areas, the policy, the practice, the training, the responsibility to make sure these things are done. We'll be able to move things from the one side over to the other side and then through to completion easier.
Yeah. The one thing that what the listeners don't know is before we sat down to record this interview, I had a chance to tour the facility and talk with you about what you're doing in your officer training, both company level and battalion chief training. And there's some training going on even on the grounds as we speak. The one thing that I'm impressed with, and it stood out to me, is the mindset of continual self-improvement seems to be a mindset here that you're good at what you do, but there's room. There's and I see that as how many departments out there are saying we would never sit down and do a post-incident action evaluation of any kind ever in our department. I talk to these people all the time that have significant near miss or injury events and then do nothing to learn anything from it or change anything that they do. And I think you had told me earlier that your 360, or you even said it here in the interview, was your 360 wasn't a policy. It was just something they might have done or might not have done. But now that you're doing 3, sometimes 4 different perspective 360s, I can only imagine the situational awareness implications that has as far as improving everyone's understanding of what's going on. But now is the 360 actually a policy in the department, or is it still just a standard that's just commonly understood?
Well, it's a tactical benchmark that's expected to be completed. So at some point on the radio transmission, you're anticipating that you'll hear 360s. The 360's been completed. So there is the box to check, right? To say that, hey, these are the things that we say we're going to do if we're competent at our job. And one of them at a fire is to get a 360 completed. Mm-hmm. And we codify that and make that something that either as the if I'm coming in later or if I'm the first in, everybody's anticipating, just like the water supply is established, right? That's another one of ours. Like having a water supply is relatively important. the 360 falls into that same category.
Yeah, I noticed that on the command board.
Right.
It's a benchmark on your command board. Now, do they have to actually say it? We've completed a 360.
Yeah, that'll be transmitted out on the radio, so everybody knows it's been done.
That's critical because there's been some incidents where, for whatever reason, 360s weren't done, but incoming command officers assumed that it had been done because it's either standard practice or policy, but the first arriving crew, for whatever reason, urgency or priority, overruled them. They didn't do it. And the commander thought that they did, but they never actually announced that they had completed the 360. So even just the announcement tells everybody on the fire ground it's been done at least once. Somebody's put eyeballs all the way around this. Now, if they can't do the 360, do they say, 360 was not accomplished or not completed?
No, I don't think so. What will usually happen, and this does often happen, is when the BC's arriving, if it hasn't been communicated on the radio, they'll ask. And sometimes say, well, I only got a 270. And so there's this measure of, have you met the intent versus the letter?
Yeah.
Right? So, you have one of these big apartment buildings. If you see one side, roll past the front, and see the other side, you've seen all that there is practically available. Right. All the data that you could achieve has been achieved. Right. So there's, I'd say that, not from a policy perspective, but from a practical perspective, I'd be comfortable with saying that it's completed at that time, just to let everybody know that we've done our proper assessment. Mm-hmm. That's something that if that event were a PIA, I would document in the PIA that, okay, this is what I did, this is why I did it, this is why I gave that radio transmission. I guess I could be called on the carpet for that. I wouldn't expect it, but it's the intent of getting the information more than But for all practical purposes, most of our events are in reasonably small buildings, and so getting a 360 is a pretty standard for a single family residential. Even if you're running down one side, looking at the back, then coming back around and looking at the other side, you've looked at all four sides of the building. That's a 360 in our world. Sure.
Now, you said there were two themes that come out of the report so far: is the 360, and then the communication handshake or the full communications loop. Are there any other themes that you see? I mean, you see you're doing 12 to 15 of these a year for 5 years. You've got 60 of these or so in hand. Do you have some themes, as far as the training chief, is this helping you to create a training agenda of I see some dots connecting here of some needs of training opportunities?
Yeah, one thing that consistently comes up that I think has gotten better over time is a standard size up. So we have a size up that's in the book, that in the policy, that includes 12 items or whatever. It's not every item is important at every fire. And then in addition, you have some discussion about whether a particular house might be called, is it 2 stories, is it 1.5 stories, is it 1 story with a daylight basement, so there's all of that discussion piece over how you might describe a building to accurately represent it to the people who are coming in behind you. And then the whole about how much fire and smoke, is it fully involved, is it partially involved, is there 2 windows of involvement, is it just smoke, is it smoke and fire? So there's all these blends of accuracy that are a struggle to be consistent across 1,000 people, even 200 officers that are not seeing fire every day, but you're trying to get a consistent message. So we do work on that through some of the officer training, some of the company officer meetings that we do bi-monthly, and focus on size up. So you could look in, there'd probably be 8 or 10 reports where it'll say something like, the size up was not accurate. For example, we have that says the correct or corrected address. So if you're sent to an address and you get there and the building's a different address, You're supposed to say this is a corrected address and then give the correct address. First in company officer may not recognize that this is 817 versus 815, for example, and that gets missed. And so because we're measuring against a standard, even though that may not have had any difference in the outcome of the event, because we're measuring against that standard, we say, the report will say, the initial size up did not include a corrected address. That's just a statement. It's not plus or minus. It's not good or bad necessarily. It's just a matter of fact that at this event we didn't get the address correct. So that's where when you're measuring against the standard, sometimes things come up that don't have a big impact on the event at all, or even any impact on the event. But because they didn't measure up to the standard, we note them in the report, even though it wouldn't necessarily rise to the level of, I'm really worried about that from a training perspective, although we do recognize that our size ups should be more consistent, and particularly partially, fully involved. The size and the description of the size and ferocity of the fire is an area where we don't have a common understanding that we're working to achieve. So that when I say there's 2 rooms involved with heavy black smoke, you envision the same thing that I'm seeing, and it means the same thing to you as it means to me when I say it. And we're getting closer to a common understanding, but only because we've identified over the course of time that the way the description was made was not accurate. We have the video, we have the still pictures. The officer said it was partially involved when in fact the entire front of the building was lighting up the night sky. Right, there was a little bit of disconnect between how they perceived it and how the people coming in behind them perceived it when they arrived. So that's just an area. I mean, the size ups is just one area where I can say there's probably, just going from memory, probably 8 or 10 recommendations relative to that. Communications, there's a big one. We had a series of events that we were unable to get a supply in a timely fashion. I mean, we ran out of water. And so you start to look at those events, and we did say, what are the common elements of this? What are the root causes of this, right? And so we were able to identify some of those root causes, but more importantly, be able to say, no, wait a minute, we need to refocus the effort of the requirement. The policy requirement is that the second-in engine is responsible to make sure that happens. That is their one and only responsibility in the policy. Somehow we drifted away from that, and I could give you the entire story of how that happened. But the fact is, it didn't. When we realized how it happened, that didn't matter how it happened. What mattered is how we were going to fix it. Right? And we fixed that by saying, same thing, operations and training saying it's important to get a supply. If you're second in, it's your job to get a supply. The assistant chief of operations telling the deputy chief to the battalion chiefs on a monthly basis or bi-monthly basis saying, look, supplies are important, second in supplies are important. And we changed the radio report to put in there, one of the benchmarks is water supply is established.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
So all of these elements together, we already had a policy that said we were supposed to get a water supply, and we did it exceedingly well for decades, and we had a short window which we would not have recognized without the PIA process, where we began to fail at that. And had we not captured it there, I think we probably at this point still be failing in that we would think that those were isolated instances until we were 2 or 3 years into that failure before we would say, wait a minute, this has happened. Instead of it happening only 2 or 3 times, it would have happened a dozen times or 15 times or 20 over the course of 5 years before, as an organization, we would have said, hey, wait a minute. But with the analysis, we were able to say, oh, wait, not only did it happen in this area of the city on this shift, and in this area of the city on this shift, and in this area of the city on this shift, that's 3 different sets of officers in 3 different areas of the city on 3 different platoons. What's the common, why is this occurring right now? And with the analysis, we were able to do that. And then, again, not just because we understood the root cause, but because we identified it was a problem, we could do something about it. And so that demonstrates the value of the PIAs right there.
Yeah, tremendously.
So there's a lot of things that only come up once, right? That are truly an anomaly, and that's fine. If you have an anomaly, it goes by. Even if you recognize it, what happens is if you don't see it again, then you can be fairly confident that that was an anomaly based on some sort of combination of circumstances and personnel. Alternately, when you start to see it repeatedly over the course of time, then it needs to be addressed. Even if you think it's an area of strength, it apparently is not quite as strong as it was before. And then it achieves the objective of getting as much as possible, getting the organization all on the same page. Because like many fire departments, we're currently understaffed. And so we have a lot of people working in positions that either on an overtime or a detail basis, it's just not their standard house.
Yeah, hold on. In the Seattle Fire Department right now, understaffed is an understatement. When we come back from this short break, we're going to listen to what Chief Jose has to share about the staffing levels at Seattle Fire Department. If you're interested in attending a live event, you can check out the Situational Awareness Matters tour stop schedule at samatters.com. Click on the Program and Keynotes tab below the header, then click on the Events Schedule tab. If I'm in your area, I hope you'll consider attending a live event. If you're not able to attend a live event, consider signing up for the SA Matters Online Academy. The Academy contains videos and articles that cover the same content as the 3-day live tour event, delivered in 14 modules that you can go through at your own pace from your own computer. The Academy Plus version includes 4 books that are referenced throughout the Academy. The Plus version is a great bargain because the tuition simply covers the costs of the books, making the Academy free. Just click on the link below the header on the SA Matters homepage titled Online Academy. Earlier today when we were talking and you told me, well, first of all, what is the sworn operational strength of the Seattle Fire Department?
Well, we're supposed to be right around 1,000, and we're right around 900.
So you're 100 positions short.
Approximately.
So when you say understaffed, I mean you're down 10%
Right.
from what would be full staffing.
Yes.
I mean that, and the reason I want to pause on that is because everybody goes, well, we're all understaffed. You're really understaffed. And you got a lot of people working a lot of overtime, which then, if I want to make the situational awareness tie-in, has a lot of people working with people that they don't necessarily regularly work with that can create some team coordination challenges. I mean, if I work with you every day, we get to be of one mind. But if I only work with you once a month, it's hard for me to get inside your mind and anticipate you as my officer, the way you're going to think and the way we're going to ebb and flow and, kind of like a husband and wife kind of get, on the same page. When you're working with somebody, the same people all the time, you get to kind of get that shared mindset. When you're on overtime and you're moving house to house and house to house and shift, that's got to create some challenges.
Well, there's definitely some challenges relative to.
I don't want to necessarily make this a conversation about overtime or short staffing, but
there's
holy
also,
cow.
I've also talked to some officers who, because we're working hard as an organization to create a common understanding of how to lay hose, how to get supplies, how to fight fire. What are sort of without being procedure-based department, which we're not, but to have a common understanding of the common methodologies that we use and understanding that most of the time we have a play that we're going to put in, and occasionally we audible and getting people to understand that. There's some strength to the fact that that the company officer has to have that discussion on a regular basis with different people, because there's a strength in understanding your own system well enough that you can explain it in a relatively short time frame run some people through some manipulative drills in order to get a common understanding, and then move forward. And so there's some strength in the repetition of having the conversation of what are the basic expectations of the organizations relative to the task and tactical requirements. There's also definitely some measured benefit to having the same crew that you work with day in and day out, and you understand each other without talking too much. So while I say that, I think from my perspective, if I'm a company officer, I'd like to have the same crew on a regular basis. It's not all bad that we have some flux in our system right now. What it requires is people who are willing to have the discussion, who are willing to learn, who are willing to think outside the box, who are gaining an understanding that just because you're in a different area of the city doesn't mean things are done differently. They really should be done in a common way, given a common structure. Right? I mean, different areas of the city have some different construction features which are predominant, but given an ordinary 3-story apartment building, we should be able to relatively quickly understand what our goals and objectives are and how we're going to achieve them, regardless of who our partner happens to be at that moment in time. And we've always had, it's more now, but we've always had a situation, like a lot of departments have Kelly days, we have Debit days, which means you're working extra days, and that's always outside your company, right? We've always had, when we're staffed at full, what we have is houses that have more people assigned than can work there, and so on the flip side, those people are always going out, and they're always working in places where they're staffed even if somebody's on vacation or on sick leave. So while it may be a little more often now, I think that at least in our fire department, there's a pretty common history of working outside your normal box and understanding that there's both some benefits and some challenges that arise from that. And so from an organizational perspective, working hard to achieve the same or a common understanding of what our language is, what our practices are, and how those apply in different environments overall will make us stronger over time.
Yeah, I agree. What are some of the things that you're doing to develop company officers and command officers? I know, we were touring around and you were showing me some of the things that you're doing for command officer development, and then you said you have the company officers in periodically to do some developmental things with them. Every department out there that has 1,000 or more employees would say, oh, the cost, the logistics, the time, the effort. And I know I've talked with people who say the only time they see the training center is when they're going through the recruit training. And once they graduate, all the training then is considered on-the-job training, on-the-street training. You're using this place like crazy here. So tell folks what you're doing here with your officers and how you do it.
Well, right now at the training center, what we're doing is we have 2 classes running commensurate. So we use 4. We bring 4. We can put on a daily basis. We can put 4 units from operations out of service for training. And today's a great example. You were coming into town, and we were hoping to have you look at our officer tactical training, but there was a multiple arm fire. As soon as the multiple arm bell hits, all those units go in service. They're all in service within about 8 to 10 minutes to refill the city with those units and to get the operational strength up to the minimum. We just canceled training, so that happens.
Yeah, doggone it! A fire got in the way of me watching the training.
And fortunately, all those students get to, even though they were more than halfway through their training day, they all get to come back. But we're running 2 evolutions right now. One is 8 of those people that come down are going through the driver's training program. So it's an 8-hour program. It's broken into blocks. We have a huge asphalt pad that's got backing and going forwards and all sorts of objectives for operating an emergency vehicle. They take the rigs out into the street with They do 2 rounds of about an hour each. One is a talking training session while the person's driving. The next one is an evaluation, to make sure that they're maintaining their lane positioning, that they're, there's a whole check sheet around that section. We have a section where they come in at speed 25 to 30 miles an hour. They hit a line, the lights come on, green, yellow, red. They have to decide whether they're going straight, turning left, turning right, hitting the brakes. They only get a second or so to decide. They have to change lanes, hit the brakes, do all that and demonstrate that they understand that they can't be hitting the brakes while they're steering, for example, right? They have to brake, steer, brake, that sort of thing. And they run through that enough times with the instructor watching them and making sure that they do it properly, so that we just build in the mental model and the muscle skill of when something pops in front of you, how do you deal with it? So that's the driver's training portion. There's so with the 4 rigs, eight of the people coming down are doing driver's training. The other 8 are doing officers training. So the officers come down. They do. There's a morning session, afternoon session. The morning session is designed around 2 things. The first is leadership. They get a reinforcement of the basic leadership skills of the Seattle Fire Department, which are trust, competence, and vision. And there's a lot of scenario and discussion based. The instructors in that class are trying to keep their input to 20% or less, and let the 8 officers work to resolve things. Today there was like 280 hours of or 280 years of service in that room with those 8 officers. I mean, it was a pretty that might be high, say 200, whatever it was. It was a big number. I can't remember. I don't want to quote too high. Don't want to overestimate. But it was over 200 anyway. And so you go, well, there's some knowledge there, and so what the instructor's job is to drag that, or is to get them to offer up their understanding of trust of their peers, trust of their subordinates, and trust of their supervisors. Are they competent? How can they help themselves become more competent? And this is where you were talking earlier about this desire to get better, is measuring yourself every day. Am I competent? Did I perform competently today? Did I perform my duties in a way that makes it so that my subordinates and my supervisors and my peers will trust me? Right? Do I understand the vision of the fire department? Do I understand the vision of the training division? Or do I understand the vision of this training exercise that I'm the instructor of today? And so we're asking our officer corps to measure themselves against those 3 principles in everything that they do. And so a lot of what we do here is based around the competence piece, like getting people to be more competent. That breeds trust. Then, so they do the leadership, then they do 2 hours of conflict resolution. So again, that's scenario based. The instructor cadre that put that together took videos of situations in the station where, one firefighter is trying to clean out the refrigerator and the other one's going, "You're throwing out my dinner," and they start a conflict. And then the video ends and the officers talk about how they would deal with that if they walked in the room, for example. And again, that's another 2-hour block. They get lunch, and then they do 4 hours of scenario-based tactical training, which is built around our basic firefighting team is 2 engines, 1 truck, 1 chief. So that's a 2-1-1. And we roll them through a 5 to 7 minute, as real time as we can get it using. We adopted some of our PIA incidents, sort of reworked them to be the scenarios around which these things take place. They have 5 to 7 minutes where they basically do the first engine, second engine, first truck, a transfer of command to the battalion chief, the scenario ends, and then they have a guided discussion with the training cadre, and that'll last, the scenario lasts somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes. The discussion will last somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour and 15 minutes. And they do 2 or 3 or 4 of those depending on how much positive discussion they get until the driver's training ends. And then when the driver's training is done, then everybody goes home together. And that's about an 8 to 8.5 hour day.
And when you were talking about they run the incident and then they do the discussion afterwards. You showed me the list of questions, or the guideline for having this discussion. They're discussing things like, when the commander said this, did the company officer really understand what they were meaning when they trying to evaluate, did they communicate in a way that developed a shared mindset at this incident? And this is such a valuable takeaway, because a lot of departments that even do any kind of tactical training, I think they do the tactical training and then they don't take the time to layer back the lessons that you do, with this checklist or this discussion sheet that you have. The fact that you run a 15-minute scenario and then spend 45 minutes discussing it and extracting out the lessons learned is that's where the value of this scenario is this shared learning that's occurring between. Now, is it the chief officer there and the company officers? Is that how the scenario runs?
Yeah, so there's 8 company officers, and then there's 1 chief officer. So the company officers, let's say we did 3 scenarios during the day, 3 of those officers would be in the hot seat, the first engine arriving, and they actually draw lots. So it doesn't matter if you're assigned to the engine or the truck. If you pull your number, you're in the hot seat as the first in engine. And then, so they do first engine, second engine, first truck, and then first chief. So for all the scenarios, the chief is the same. The chief stays throughout the training day. But as soon as the transfer of command, as soon as the chief officer does a transfer of command briefing with the first in company officer and assumes the role of the IC, that's when the scenario actually ends. And then we have the discussion about what occurred. So you're right that, like, when we talk about the commanders, usually the first in engine officer is the IC until the battalion chief arrives. That's the way our system works. We have 4-person minimum staffing most of the time. Not by policy, the first in officer is in command of the incident. Most of the time, they will deploy their crew to the inside. It's anticipated that the second in engine officer understands the need that their assignment is the backup line on the radio, but they understand through training that their job is to get into the space, connect with the first attack team, make sure that the first line reaches the fire area, and then with their crew get the backup line into a position to support and defend the attack line. So that's, even though we tell them you're the backup line, they understand that this is their actual tasks. Mm-hmm. The first one being to make contact with that first in team and provide direct company officer level supervision and communicate to the IC.
Now, when you say that the first in officer is the incident commander until relieved by the chief officer arriving, is this command position as an incident commander on the exterior in a fixed position, or is this working command with their crew on the inside?
No, they're outside. They may not be in a fixed position. I mean, we're going to anticipate they're going to get to 360. They're not tied to a command vehicle, but they're outside the structure, and that meets some requirements that we have in the state of Washington relative to the 2 in, 2 out, and we have a fairly restrictive administrative code relative to that particular rule that. Our organization has said that in order to meet this law, this is how we're going to operate. Mm-hmm. We can have a discussion all day about whether or not the officer should be inside with the crew, and it might be an interesting discussion, but in our state, we have the state law that we feel like this meets that requirement, which is why we make such an impetus for the second officer. And very often, I mean, the standard deviation between the first engine and the second engine in our fire department is somewhere around 90 seconds. And there is a deployment time for that first in hand line. So while there can be a period of time where the first in crew is operating, and certainly on the outskirts of the city that could be extended, or if the second unit, the normal second unit is on the EMS alarm, the standard deviation is around 90 seconds. And so, organizationally, we feel like getting that officer immediately into that space, provides that supervision as quickly as we can do so within the scope of the law. That being said, the first officer, if conditions are such that they do not feel their crew can operate safely without them, and there's some variability to that too.
Mm-hmm.
We have crews that have the two people on the tailboard have been operating together for 10 years plus. Both are highly motivated, highly dedicated professionals who are training every single day and every weekend are training other people. That crew has, in my mind, would get more leeway from their company officer than if the crew in the back is a detail in who is got 14 months and a recruit who just came out of the academy. Mm-hmm. Right, the level of risk that the officer is willing to allow them to accept without direct supervision would be different in those two cases.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the company officer's job to make that decision. But most of the time, conditions in single-family residential, which is where we have most of our events, the instant three-quarter hand line provides adequate protection for the first-in company to operate for a short period of time before the second officer makes it into that space.
Sure. No, you're bringing these companies out, and the officers are doing officer training. Everyone else is doing the driver training. How long does it take? Well, you're in the middle of it right now. How long will it take from the first crew that was out here until the very last one is trained? I'm trying to get my arms wrapped around the magnitude of this project, of this kind of training. This is not something you do in 14 days.
No, it's 6 weeks.
6 weeks.
Yeah, so from the day that we start training until we'll be done, we have a 6-week block of time. Now, this one will be driven by the number of students that need driver's training because that number is higher. It's on average. Everybody in operations division gets driver training like this. It's 8 hours of driver's training every 4 years. Everybody, the officers, the relief drivers, every single person who might drive a fire engine or a fire truck comes for 8 hours of driver's training every 4 years.
Is this driven by department policy or state law?
Right now, that's a good question that we're probably what we have is we have submitted our curriculum to the state for accreditation, and so the state's the accrediting agency. We're a sub-accredited agency, so we can do firefighter 1, firefighter 2, etc. here. EVIP is the state program that we're trying to say that this is our curriculum to meet this objective. And we've just submitted for accreditation. So as part of our accreditation, what we've said is, if you're going to be a driver, here's the training that you're going to receive. So we develop a piece of curriculum and we deliver it to 25% of the department each year for 4 years. So the 6 trainings that we're doing here is the same 6 weeks that we did last year for driver's training and the year before and the year before. This is the 4th year of the cycle. Next year, we'll have a new piece of curriculum that will focus on some different area. And we find that by every time there's a collision or accident or something involving apparatus, there's a stack of paperwork, as you might imagine, and you probably have some familiarity with, that gets submitted. And we, our driver's training instructor, as well as our accident prevention board, which is part of the safety division, it's a team that includes the local has a representative, local, the firefighters local, the chiefs local, etc. There's a committee, and they sort of look at these events and go, here's where we're having most of our incidents. And historically they're perfectly clear day, not responding, limited clearance, not on the driver's side. That's the most common problem we have. Anyway, we'll design our curriculum for the next 4 years around where our areas of weakness have demonstrated themselves to be in the previous 4 years, both through the accidents and through the input of the people who do the driver's training. So they're the ones that are sitting in the right front seat with the drivers for 8 hours of training every day for 4 years. They get a pretty good sense of where some of the skill sets might need to be enhanced. And so we'll build another piece of curriculum that will run for 4 years.
Okay. All right. Now, out there, I think there's probably someone sitting there rubbing their forehead saying, this guy's got to have a staff of 25 people in his training division to get done everything that they're doing. Do you?
No. I have I do have great support. So the officers who are working for me and the civilian staff that I have here, I cannot sing their praises enough, and I haven't even been here 6 months. I got moved here. I was given the opportunity to come to training in February, and it's just been a joy every day since. That being said, for example, the driver's training program is run. I have two captains. One runs my recruit side, and one runs my in-service side. I also have civilian staff. I have somebody who runs the facility here, which is pretty extensive job in and of itself, just to make sure everything's working. The pumps, the fires, the smoke, as well as, as you saw, a fair number of props.
Oh, yeah.
That we have available here, in addition to the classrooms and the IT and all that stuff. So I have somebody who that's their full-time position. I have administrative support. I have two administrative specialists who handle, the filing, the phones, all of that stuff, the scheduling of the classrooms, memos that need to get cut, all that sort of thing. And then somebody who we have someone on staff who is focused on the wellness fitness of the organization. They run out of the training division. So my uniform side, which is what we've been sort of focused on today, is an in-service captain and a recruit captain. So the recruit captain covers recruit school. We have been only running one or no recruit classes a year. We're in a cycle now where we're going to be hiring, I predict we're going to be hiring twice a year, 25 students twice a year for the foreseeable future, which is more along the lines of our historical average. So that pretty much takes that captain and 3 lieutenants. That's a full-time gig running that recruit school. It's 14, 15 weeks of academy plus your prep time plus your downtime. You're looking at, easily 20 to 22 weeks, not counting any in-between time for vacation, etc. And then on the in-service side, I have one captain. There's 2 lieutenants that work for him. One does strictly driver's training and one does EMS. And then, so the driver's training package is developed primarily by the driving lieutenant, but all of the instructors are operations folks that we bring in for the day. So for the driver's training, we'll bring in 4 instructors. We'll pay them overtime. They're regular drivers that are driving a fire engine or a fire truck every single day of the in operations. And so they come down here and spend 8 hours teaching the other folks. On the in-service side, the captain is more program management. So when we talk about the officer training that we're doing right now is the leadership piece in the morning, leadership and conflict resolution in the morning. An operations captain, Captain Mike Galliano, actually was in charge of the development of that program, the curriculum design, the curriculum approval, test teaches, train the trainer, that sort of thing. The captain of in-service training that Mike reported to would do like this, some of the scheduling of instructors, make sure that the memo gets gets published and delivered, schedules the classroom, and it does other things to help that cadre of instructors. Then the officers also in the afternoon, that was Captain Scott Gray was in charge of that program. Again, he has a curriculum design team. All their time is compensated on overtime. So we do have some budget leverage to get these folks in. And so one of the things, there's some challenges to that. One is you're always looking for someone to manage a project, which can be a challenge, although we don't have that much of a struggle to find people who want to do good work. Our officer corps is very, very committed to the organization, and by and large are willing, not only willing, but trying to think of the right word. They're willing to step up. They're looking for an opportunity most of the time to have an impact. And then so Scott had a team as well that designed all of the tactical stuff. Took the PIAs, read through them, designed the curriculum. They did some test teaches, and we found some areas where we needed to adjust the logistics of what we were doing, because there's a lot of moving parts to the way we're running those scenarios. And then again, do the test teaches, train the trainers. We have evaluations every day. We codify those. I send those to the lead instructors once a week, as well as to the administration. My boss, the assistant chief, and the assistant chief of ops get copies of the eval forms each week so that they can see how the program's running. And so, there's a lot of moving parts and pieces, but there's a lot of dedicated professionals, both inside the training division and in the Seattle Fire Department, that make all that work. And we've been using that system. That's one of the things that I did for almost a decade when I was in ops, both at the lieutenant and then the captain and then the battalion level, was to help with that curriculum design and help with that delivery. So when you're doing that, you're working your operation schedule, you're coming here to the training center 2 or 3 times a week, or we did a lot at acquired structures as well, and you're teaching, firefighter safety, bailouts, whatever the curriculum for the year happens to be. That's where we developed all the air management stuff. That's where I got a lot of my skill set and understanding of the situational awareness piece of how to design this curriculum so that officers not only go through the process in an accurate way of doing tactics, so that their muscle memory and their mind, the way that the speed at which their mind works when they're solving problems, has some relation to the real world, but also developing the skill set to be able to sit down afterwards and ask questions in a way to bring that decision making forward in a way that everybody understands all of the pieces that went into that puzzle, and where there are challenges or where people make, let's just call it a tactical error, right? They make a less than the most effective choice in their tactics, that we examine what cues they're looking at, what history they have. A lot of the times when I'm watching this officers training, officers created habits in order to pass promotional exams, because that was their training for a long time. That was the officer training, was getting ready for the promotional exams. You put them in a sim, and all of a sudden they start spouting the same things, but there's no relationship to the time involved, because in the promotional, if you say it, you can check the box,
right,
and you can consider it done.
Literally follow a script.
Yeah, in the real world, if you say to lay a supply, that's a 3-minute operation, right? So that crew is not available for the next assignment until 3 minutes from now.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to build in so that the speed at which they are given the opportunity to make decisions reflects some component of the real world, and then also the skill set of the instructor cadre, which is really developed over the course of time of being able to draw that information from the participants and do it in a way that the participants feel valued. Nobody's pointing fingers. We're trying to come to a common understanding, and there are challenges when you're doing that, but in the end, what you want is somebody to you can give them that slide in their slide tray, that they see this event, and so they know how that thing works. But if it's only black and white, it doesn't help that much. So through that process of asking them questions, what you're doing is you're letting that individual fill their own slide with the color that it takes to make it vivid. And when it's vivid for them, then they've got it, and they can apply it to the next opportunity. And that comes through that facilitated discussion.
Yeah, great stuff. Well, we're out of time. We're at the 1 hour limit, and that's where I like to keep the radio shows too. So thank you for giving me the gift of your time, both for the tour and for sitting down and sharing some of the perspective of the things that you're doing here in Seattle. Because I think you guys are, whether you would think that you are, I think you're a humble man, but I'll say it, you guys are cutting edge in how you're thinking of this whole process of continual officer development, continual improvement. I mean, you're already telling me things you're going to be doing the next time and the next time. That's phenomenal. What I hope from this, Phil, is that others are inspired. Maybe they're just a little, right now, feeling down and out. They don't have the staff. They don't have the momentum. They don't have this. They don't have that. They don't have the budget. To see the things that you guys are doing here, maybe will give them some inspiration, that that fresh view of, this can be done and it's the right thing to do when you're leading the training division, is to make sure that everybody is, as you say, one of the three of your competencies is competent, right? Is one of the three: competent, trust, and
competency, and vision.
Yeah, trust, competency, and vision. And I think you're living that and displaying that. So thank you for sitting down with me.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Rich. And hey, thanks for coming out to see us.
Well, that's it. Episode 11 is complete. Thank you, Chief Jost, for spending some time with me during my visit to the Seattle Fire Department. And thank you for sharing some of your valuable time with me today as a listener. I sincerely appreciate your support of the SA Matters mission. If you like the show, please go to iTunes and search for SA Matters Radio and subscribe to the podcast and leave your feedback and a 5-star review. This will help others find the show. You can also sign up for the free SA Matters monthly newsletter by visiting samatters.com and clicking on the red box on the right side of the home page. Be safe out there, and may the peace of the Lord and strong situational awareness be with you always.
You've been listening to the Situational Awareness Matters radio show with Dr. Richard B. Gassaway. If you are interested in learning more about situational awareness, human factors, and decision-making under stress, visit samatters.com. If you are interested in booking Dr. Gassaway for an upcoming event, visit his personal website at richgassaway.com.